Once again, I'm Barbara Gottlieb, PSR's Program Director for Environment and Health. And our topic tonight is the climate emergency that we're facing. Specifically, we're going to be bringing you the latest on climate science and impacts. Our speaker will provide an overview of the findings from three very important climate reports that were published just in the past couple of months. I'm sure you're aware of them. There are the IPCC special report called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, also known as Special Report 1.5. The fourth National Climate Assessment, which focuses on climate impact here in the United States, and then the Lancet Countdown with its specific focus on health. What all of these reports indicate individually, and then again even more so when we look at them collectively, is that we really face a climate emergency. We need to take sweeping action, we in this country and in countries all around the world, if we're going to fend off the most catastrophic of the climate effects. And this is a theme that you can expect to hear more on from PSR in the coming year, including on future webinars. Because programmatically, PSR addresses the climate challenge by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially from fracked gas, and increasing the uptake of clean, safe, renewable energy, with a particular focus on policy initiatives at the state and local levels. But we're also going to be asking ourselves if we are developing responses on a scale that's large enough to respond to the urgency of the situation. So stay tuned for future presentations and stick with us for tonight's presentation.
How does that look?
That looks good.
All right. Should I go for it?
That's great. Well, let me introduce you. Our speaker tonight is Hunter Cutting. He's a climate writer based in San Francisco, a veteran political director, and currently he serves as the Director of Strategic Communications for Climate Nexus. He has written extensively on media and communications. He has developed new methodologies to extend the field of media analysis. Hunter holds a degree in Conservation and Resource Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm told that he spends most of his weekends sailing on the San Francisco Bay. So we know he keeps a keen eye on both the weather and the climate. Thank you, Hunter, for joining us tonight. After Hunter's presentation, we'll hear a quick response from Dr. Walter Tsu. Walter Tsu, MD, MPH, was a health commissioner for the city of Philadelphia. He currently serves as an adjunct professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. And Dr. Tsu is also a longtime member of PSR, president of the board of directors of PSR Philadelphia, and that chapter's interim executive director. So his response to Hunter's observations will inject the perspective of a health professional and also a pretty much full-time climate and health policy advocate. So just before we begin, a few quick housekeeping items. Our webinar will last about 1 hour. We're behind now, so we'll do what we can to catch up. The plan was for Hunter to speak for about half an hour, and then for us to hear Dr. Tsu's brief response, and then we have and we will reserve a chunk of time for your questions. But because we have a pretty full house tonight, and also, of course, because we're a little bit behind, we're going to keep all of you, our webinar attendees, on mute. But we really want to hear from you in the form of your questions. So for the Q&A, what I'm asking you to do is to write your questions into that comment box that you'll see in the dock on the upper right of your screen. And my colleague, Antonia Herzog, will read the questions, and then we'll have responses both from Hunter and also from Dr. Tsu. This webinar is being recorded so we can share it with folks who were unable to join us tonight. So with no further ado, I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Hunter Cutting. Hunter, it's all yours.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to quickly jump into it. And so tonight I wanted to talk about 4 major science and economic reports that have come out literally in the last couple months. First of all, the IPCC special report on warming of 1.5 degrees. Then the U.S. National Climate Assessment just put out its 4th climate assessment. Then, of course, the Lancet report that also has just come out. And finally, Bloomberg recently put out an assessment on where we're going with the economics of the climate change transition globally. All 4 of these reports are authoritative, comprehensive assessment reports. None of them provide anything in terms of new research. They're simply assessing the existing field of literature and looking at the strengths and weaknesses of existing literature and producing authoritative, comprehensive assessments of where we stand. So I'm going to try and synthesize as much as I can for you of these 4 assessments. It's a very broad picture. A lot of these assessments actually are overlapping, so I'm not going to go through the individual findings of each. And of course, you can go online and they all have executive summaries and you can dive into the details yourself. But I'm going to try and give you a very broad brush picture of where we're going, both the science and economics of climate change. So what's happening in the big picture? The economics are going in the right direction. They're not going as fast and as deep as they need to be, but they're definitely going in the direction that we need them to go. And so that's a very good and hopeful sign. The transition to a clean economy and a clean world is a lot easier than anybody imagined even 5 years ago. But as many of you know, the politics are heading very much in the wrong direction, particularly at the national level in some very key countries, notably right now the United States and Brazil. But the politics are actually going quite well at the subnational level, as they discuss in certain states in the United States, California, Colorado, as well as in certain countries overseas. But on the whole, the politics are heading in the wrong direction. And that's the overall big picture conundrum that we're faced with right now. That while making the transition has never been easier, it's well within our reach, the politics are actually heading in the wrong direction. What has to happen? Well, in parlance of the IPCC, unprecedented action has to happen. We need the economics to be going in the right direction, and we need to deepen that and extend that. And we also need all countries to head in the same direction. And that's actually quite a challenge, especially politically. No one should underestimate the challenge. But to be clear, the challenge is primarily political. It's not a science challenge. We understand exactly what's causing global warming. We understand exactly how much emissions have to be reduced. There's no mystery about any of that. We even understand quite well where the investments need to be, and we understand quite well that, in fact, these investments pay off. It's really not about the scale of the investments that's a question anymore. It's the direction of the investments. We basically need to stop investing in fossil fuels, and all that investment instead needs to be going into renewable energy. And quite frankly, the payoff is just as big. And so it's the politics that need to change to make that sea change in the direction of the investments. Okay, so let's drill down into some of the findings from some of these reports. So this is the big sort of sea change that's occurred in the last several years from the climate science community. Whereas before, climate change was sort of a prospective thing. We thought that the impacts were going to be happening. Now the impacts are happening. They've been calculated, the attribution studies have been done, and we're actually the economic losses from climate change are already beginning to mount. And that's well documented now in the literature. And this is actually a big change in the last 5 years, going from looking at climate change to something that would happen in the future to something that's actually happening now and is incurring major economic losses now. This is not any different, but the science is sort of reaffirming that the business as usual path will be simply devastating. This isn't a new sort of finding. Many of you have heard about the sort of international goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees. It emerged in the international climate negotiations in Copenhagen and Cancun about 8 years ago and was reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement. But what we're learning now over the last several years is in fact that 2 degrees is no longer a good goal. It's quite frankly a bad place to be. You don't want to be in a world with 2 degrees of warming. And this has really been established extremely well by the IPCC 1.5 report, which was in fact commissioned to investigate this exact issue. The last finding from these reports is that we, in fact, can limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The problem is mainly political. It's not economic, which is not to sort of discount the scale of the challenge. To get all countries heading in the right direction is going to be extraordinarily difficult. To get that unprecedented action will be challenging, but everyone should understand that it's primarily a political challenge or a social challenge. It's not actually an economic challenge. And again, this is how they sort of They're sort of, they don't use the word political. This is the sort of the euphemism they talk about is unprecedented action and cooperation among nations. So I'm going to sort of mix and match some of the findings from the various science reports. And so let's start off with U.S. National Climate Assessment. And it just makes that fundamental finding that the impacts and the costs of climate change are already being felt in the United States. So this isn't an issue of polar bears. This isn't an issue of sea level rise affecting Pacific low-lying islands. This is an issue of people in the United States already being affected dearly and severely by climate change. And this is sort of looking forward now to get an understanding of like what's at stake if we stay on this business as usual path. And this report actually had some nice detail about the economics. We're talking about annual losses in individual sectors, not even economy-wide, of hundreds of billions of dollars every year, staying on the business as usual path. A lot of you who sort of deal with health issues, sort of, you may have been sort of hear about this thing like, well, there's going to be some good impacts of climate change. There can be some bad impacts of climate change, like, you know, warmer winters will be a good thing. The U.S. climate assessment was very clear is that the bad impacts are going to dwarf any good impacts that may come about, including mortality from extreme cold temperatures versus the mortality from extreme heat. This is another finding from the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which documents not only have wildfires been increasing dramatically in size and scale and scope in the United States, but about half of that increase is explicitly due to climate change. And another finding that came out in both the U.S. National Climate Assessment and the Lancet has been the dramatic increase in particulate accumulation that comes along, particulate pollution that comes along those wildfires that many of you, I think, are dealing with in your clinics and your practices. So again, this is a very strong finding that not only have the wildfires been increasing, but about half of that increase is due to global warming. Similarly, we now have a definitive finding from the U.S. National Climate Assessment that global warming has, in fact, been a contributor to hurricane activity in the Atlantic. For those of you who've been following this ongoing saga, it's long been established that we have been having more hurricane activity, but there's been a long-running debate about whether or not you can attribute it to climate change. Well, that debate has now moved on. Yes, you can attribute it, at least part of it, to climate change, possibly all of it. That's sort of where the debate is now, is how much of the increase in hurricane activity can you attribute to climate change. But we now know for a fact that climate change is increasing hurricane activity in the Atlantic. Another thing we know from the NCA and the Lancet report is that heat waves now are more frequent and lasting longer. As a result, we have increased mortality. We also have drying out. A region in the Southwest, which is leading to increases in things like valley fever. So very clear health-related impacts to a very clear weather phenomenon, which is that heat waves are now more frequent and lasting longer due to climate change. Also, we have an increase in the scale and scope and geographic range of vector-borne diseases. Again, that's due to climate change. This is a finding that's particularly true for the United States. You get sort of varied impacts in tropical countries where actually, disturbingly enough, temperatures are actually getting so severe that that it's diminishing the range of some vector-borne diseases because the vectors actually can't cope with the increased temperatures. But in the United States, unfortunately, it's increasing the range of these vectors and increasing vector-borne disease as a result. Looking ahead, the National Climate Assessment sort of did a comparison of what we can expect if we stay in the business as usual course versus if we sort of charted a moderate course, not even trying to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, to hold temperatures to 2 degrees, but just try to do a moderate range. And this just gives you some sense of scale of how bad things will get if we stay on the course that we're headed now. We're talking about tens of thousands of deaths per year from extreme temperature, and millions of hours of labor being lost due to extreme temperatures. And this just gives you a sense of how devastating the business as usual course is, and the risks that we're running by staying on this course. The IPCC then sort of drilled down and said, well, what's the difference between staying on 1.5 degrees and staying on 2 degrees? 2 degrees of warming Celsius doesn't sound like a lot of warming, but in matter of fact, it's quite a lot. Just for comparison's sake, 8 degrees of warming is about the level of warming that gets us close to past geologic eras that had crocodiles living at the Arctic. 2 degrees of warming is a lot of warming. An analogy to body temperatures actually might be a bit better of analogy, and as you all know, to increase the body temperature by 3.6 degrees is permanently, without being able to go backwards, is quite devastating, and that's what we're looking at right now. And there's a big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, not surprisingly, when it comes to the number of hot days, the temperature of the hottest days, and even the temperature of the coldest nights. And as we know, it's those nighttime temperatures that are so critically important, because we need those cold nights because they provide respite during heat waves that's critically needed, especially by the elderly and the ill and by children. Here's just some sort of quantitative numbers where, you know, the percentage of the population that's exposed to severe heat, like those epic European heat waves that killed hundreds, is going to be much greater in a 2 degree world compared to a 1.5 degree world. And so this is sort of this is a little bit of the bitter irony that we're facing right now, is that we're already suffering severe losses due to climate change, and even if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees, it's going to be bad. But it's going to be much, much worse at 2 degrees. And so we're faced with the choice of which kind of world do we want to live in. Do we want to live in a 2 degree world or a 1.5 degree world? And we still have that choice. That's a choice we still have and we can still make. Crop yields, likewise, there'll be minimal reduction in corn harvest in the tropics on a 1.5 degree world, and then it starts beginning to bite pretty severely. 7% is not a lot, but if you're in a region that's already facing devastating famines, that is a matter of life and death for some communities. Corals is another area where the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is quite dramatic. Basically, in a 2 degree world, we lose all the coral reefs. And as you know, the coral reefs are actually a key ecosystem for maintaining ocean life of all types, not just the reefs, but many fisheries depend on those coral reefs as nurseries. Again, you just don't want to live in a 2 degree world. You really want to avoid that at all costs. But that is something that these reports that have come out are very definitive, is that we can avoid much of the losses and risks by limiting 1.5 degrees. There's a big difference between the two. So where are we? This is from the IPCC. This is actually one of their slides. And they're very definitive that the current national pledges in the Paris Agreement are not enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And they set out a very good and clear benchmark of reducing pollution by the year 2030. And I think that's a nice benchmark because that's just 12 years away from now. It's something that I think everyday people can wrap their heads around. It's much less than, for instance, the length of a mortgage. It's well within the planning horizon for people who are doing things like capital expenditures and cities that have got to do planning for sewers, et cetera. And so I think increasingly we're all going to be hearing about benchmarks tied to the 2030 year. And it's a key thing as you're looking forward and you're trying to understand the adequacy of climate plans that you may be hearing about at your local level, at your state level, is to ask, well, what are they calling for by the year 2030? This is what the NCA has to say, the U.S. National Climate Assessment. It's sort of saying the obvious, but, you know, while we're making progress, we're not nearly at the scale where we need to be on both the mitigation and the adaptation. And that's one of the sort of new realities that we have to contend with in this world, is that because the losses are already mounting, it's no longer a choice between mitigation and adaptation. We actually have to do both. We have to reduce pollution to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and we're going to have to learn to adapt and cope with the impacts of climate change that we can no longer avoid. We have to do both. So what do you got to do? Well, it's a range of activities. It's no surprise here. It's not like there's like one silver bullet. You really need to scale up investment in clean energy and energy efficiency, and you can see here it says by a factor of 5. And again, it's really less about increasing the scale of overall investment and more about shifting investment. And it is a 180-degree shift. All that money, and there's just billions of dollars every year going into fossil fuel infrastructure, that needs to stop basically. And that investment needs to change direction. So it's really not so much about increasing the scale of the effort, it's about changing the direction of the effort. So let's dig into a little bit about what exactly what are those sort of benchmarks for what we need to do for a 1.5 degree world. That's clear that the cheapest path, the least cost path, the best path, however you want to put it, calls for getting to zero pollution by the year 2050, preferably by the year 2040. So again, that's a very good, clear benchmark for us. And that pollution needs to be reduced 50% by 2030. Now, there's other paths we can take. You could choose to reduce pollution less by 2030. Let's say you only want to reduce pollution by 40% or 30%, but then you got to reduce it even more sharply later, and that turns out to be a more expensive way forward. So these are benchmarks for what's actually the best way forward, the cheapest way forward, the lowest cost path. And again, the IPCC report is very clear that the economics are there to do it. It's not a huge lift in terms of economics. It's a huge lift in terms of politics and shifting the direction of the investment. So the challenge going forward, we need to further accelerate the transformation of the power sector. You know, the places where we get power from right now to power our electric grid, basically, which is one of the largest contributors of pollution. It's already going a historic revolution, and many of you in the United States may be seeing that in your own regions. And we need to basically accelerate that transformation. And then we need to sort of shift the other sectors as well. The transportation sector needs to shift from gas-powered cars to electric cars. Same thing with agriculture and industry. And so the historic revolution that we're seeing in the power sector, where wind and solar is now the cheapest power available, didn't happen by accident. It happened by policies that sort of incentivized the investments that got us to cheap wind and solar. And so we need to sort of put the same sort of kind of policies in place to transform those other sectors. Again, this is straight out of the IPCC report. Those transitions have to occur over the next 10 to 20 years. And they're going to require unprecedented action and cooperation. Again, this is language from the IPCC report. They don't use the word politics, they use the word cooperation and action, but that's the plain English translation there for you. So again, the economics need to be headed in that direction, and we need to deepen them, and the politics need to be going that way. What's actually happening? The economics are sort of headed in that direction. They need to be deepened. The politics are going the wrong way, except in some states and some countries. So let's talk a little bit about those economics, because I do think that's the good news here. This comes from that Bloomberg study that I showed at the very beginning, and this shows what's actually being built in developing countries. And as you can see now, in developing countries, they're actually building more wind and solar than they're building coal-fired power and natural gas-powered plants. And what's fascinating about this is that they're not doing this with money from developed countries. The primary financing for this shift is coming from developing countries as well. So not only are they building more wind and solar than they're building anything else, but they're doing it with their own money, which again is just indicative of this revolution that's happening where wind and solar are actually cheaper than fossil fuels now. So again, we just need to get politics headed the right way so that there's no more money going into fossil fuels. It's all going into wind and solar. Here in the United States, you guys might have seen the news, one of the largest utilities in the United States, it covers 8 states, Excel, it's in the Midwest, in the Colorado region, Minnesota region, just made the commitment to go 80% carbon free by the year 2030, which is well within our benchmark of a 50% reduction by 2030, and 100% carbon free by the year 2050. So this is a private utility, right? They've got shareholders to respond to, and they think that they can deliver the maximum profit to their shareholders and meet these kind of pollution reduction goals. So again, it just goes to show that the economics are headed in the right direction. Similarly, again, this last week, a lot's been happening. The largest shipping company in the world, Maersk, just made the commitment to go carbon neutral by the year 2050. And many of you probably followed the news over the summer where California set a goal of going carbon neutral by the year 2045. And I just wanted to point out that that's not a sort of a goal or a policy direction. That's hard and fast law. And this last 2 weeks ago, basically the final regulation was put in place that all new homes in California from the year 2020 onward, just a year and a half from now, will be solar powered. All new homes. It's the law of the land. And so it's sort of indicative of what you can do when you get politics going the right way. So I just want to sort of recap with those benchmarks because I think a lot of us are sort of curious, like what should we be looking for from our political leaders? So I'm just going to offer you some benchmarks that I think are consistent with what the IPCC report is, the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and the Bloomberg report. And the number one benchmark is that there should be no more investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines, power plants, LNG terminals, because basically it's throwing good money after bad. All these investments will have to be retired early. They cannot be operated to the end of their lifetime because we've got to get to zero pollution by the year 2050. We have to cut pollution in half in 12 years. So either these things are going to keep operating and keep polluting, or they're going to have to be shut down early. Either way, it's a bad decision. We shouldn't be doing it. You should be looking for policies that call for 50% reduction by the year 2030, 12 years from now. You probably heard that phrase, we've got 12 years to take action. This is what they mean. 12 years to cut pollution by 50%, and then we got to get to zero by 2050. Everything going forward, especially homes and cars. And then I'm going to take a privilege here and offer you a political suggestion, and I hope I don't get in trouble with the webinar organizers, but I personally feel if you want to change the politics, and if we've seen that's the big thing that has to happen in the United States, no more campaign contributions from fossil fuel companies. It's very equivalent morally to taking money from fossil fuel companies, and so we should be looking for pledges from politicians to stop that. So just to recap, back to the science and economics, the impacts and losses due to climate change are already mounting. That's very well established now in the academic literature. Again, the academic literature has established now that 2 degrees is no longer a good goal. We're already paying the costs. 2 degree, you don't want to live in a 2-degree world. The business as usual path will be devastating. That's not a new finding, but that is, again, being reaffirmed. And again, the literature is very clear that we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The problem is mainly the lack of unprecedented, not economic challenges. And I was talking very fast, so I apologize for that, but it seemed to be appropriate with where we are, and I will stop there. And also, I do want to shout out to my colleague, Paige Knappenberger, who helped me prepare the materials around the Lancet report. Thanks.
Woo! Hunter, that was a real tour de force. That was really great. Thank you so much. Very informative, a little bit scary, but I really heard you. I heard you loud and clear that there's a clear path forward. It's a challenging one, but we can do it. What I'd like to do now, and recognizing that we are tight for time, but I wanted to turn to Dr. Tsu and ask him, first of all, Dr. Tsu, as a health professional, what did you hear that struck you as particularly significant?
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Hunter. That was a great talk. I live in a state of Pennsylvania, which actually, you talked about political contributions. Over the last 7 years, the gas industry has given $64 million to our state legislators. So they basically the gas industry basically owns our state legislators. But our governor, who is also a Democrat, also is in the pockets of the gas industry. And many of you may know that we sit on top of the Marcellus Shale, which is this big depository of shale gas. And it's been exploited throughout the state. And many of the pipelines that are going out toward Philadelphia, where I live, are a product of that shale gas. Now, if we hear what Hunter is saying, we really need to stop all that shale gas development totally. The problem is that although you say the politics are the problems, fighting the politics is incredibly difficult. As an example, today I testified in our city council in Philadelphia about the idea of developing a liquefied natural gas terminal where some of this frack gas will reside in Philadelphia. And I explained why I think this is a bad idea for the many reasons that you described. But from an economics perspective, the politicians feel that this is a way in which they could have a reserve of gas available and stabilize gas prices. And so they approved the idea of developing an LNG terminal in our city. The idea of actually transitioning all the heaters in Philadelphia in our homes, that most of them perhaps are either oil or gas, and converting them to electric boilers, which is something that we would really want to do if we wanted to change, dramatically change in the next 12 years and transition to depending on electric heat rather than gas and oil heat, is a very daunting task. And I can tell you the politicians are very wary about how exactly practically they can go about doing that. Now, I'm not trying to make excuses for them, but I'm trying to illustrate that it's one thing to say we need to get the politics out of this, but the money that's behind these guys and the difficulty of actually implementing our goal is very challenging. Despite that, I think we as health professionals have a very key role because we're very credible voices. And the issues that you nicely outlined about the heat strokes and heat waves, the mold that comes from excess flooding, the problems with vector-borne diseases are all serious issues. So I know there are going to be lots of questions, and so I'm not going to delve into it further because I could probably talk for another hour. But let me stop there and let other people ask questions. And I'd love to hear what Hunter thinks about some of all of these issues.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Tsu. And you're right, we're going to move immediately to questions. We have quite a stack of questions and some of them very interesting. So Antonia, could you please read us the first question, and then Hunter and Dr. Tsu just jump in with your answers.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Barb. A bunch of questions here. Let's start with this question about hurricanes. So the question is there a percentage attribution for hurricanes to climate change, such as was presented for wildfires, or is it just that they're confirming that climate change is responsible for some of the increase in frequency and severity?
This is Hunter. Should I tackle that one?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
There is no number for how much the activity has increased due to climate change. There's actually a widespread academic opinion on that. Some scientists feel that it's very minor. I mean, there has been a large increase in hurricane activity. Let's just be clear about that. Since the 1970s, there's been a dramatic increase in hurricane activity, but there's a widespread of opinion about how much of that you can contribute to climate change. I should say, though, that most of the damage from hurricanes does not come from the wind damage. Most of the damage from hurricane comes from the flooding, either from the extreme precipitation or from the coastal flooding. And in those dimensions, the role of climate change is quite dramatic. So many of you probably followed what happened with Hurricane Florence. There was actually already attribution work done that has shown that maybe as much as half of the rainfall during Hurricane Florence was due to global warming. Basically, the atmosphere is a lot warmer. It can hold a lot more moisture, and just like a bigger bucket sort of dumps out more water when it empties, these storms dump out a lot more water now. Similarly, there were at least 6 different attribution studies done on Hurricane Harvey, and those found that the share of rainfall in Hurricane Harvey due to climate change was as much as 38%. So we're seeing dramatic increases in damage. On the sea level rise, sorry for geeking out here, but again, we see dramatic increases in damage due to sea level rise. In the case of Hurricane Sandy, something about 27 square miles of territory along the coast was flooded purely due to the fact that sea level rise has elevated storm surge, and it now extends a lot further inland. And as a result, about $2 billion of damage was done during Superstorm Sandy due to the extension of storm surge by sea level rise. So it's important not to focus just on the hurricane activity and intensity, but also look at the flooding, because that's really where we see the hand of climate change. I'll shut up.
Okay, thanks very much for that answer. Another one, and your thoughts on it would be appreciated. What are the person saying they didn't hear anything about the food that we eat and how it impacts climate change, in particular red meat as a major contributor to greenhouse gases. Is that something that you've looked into or know anything about?
That's actually something that the IPCC report did cover. And as many of you know, there's sort of been a long-running debate about whether or not lifestyle changes are required in order to really limit climate change as much as we can. And the IPCC report was actually rather definitive that lifestyle changes are necessary if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Particularly unsustainably raised, livestock is part of the problem. And I think that's going to be something different going forward now, is that there is a clear scientific consensus that if you want to do all you can to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, changing diets so that we no longer consume unsustainably raised livestock is in fact required.
Okay, thanks. This is a question for Dr. Tsao, or sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. In Philadelphia, the proposed renewable natural gas plant is an example of a potential solution that is also problematic for local communities. How do we as physicians guide public policy making in such cases?
You mean the proposed liquid gas terminal or the renewable gas plant? Isn't that, what was the word again?
Yeah, he said renewable natural gas plant, but I think...
I think, our argument really is that the liquefied natural gas terminal is just one example of the whole gas infrastructure that actually needs to have planned obsolescence. Those are the terms I call it. We need to talk about on a national level, how are we going to phase out of using fossil fuels, including natural gas. The real problem is that the industry has marketed natural gas as the alternative to coal, which they have denigrated, and rightfully so. But to believe somehow or another that with there's sort of a halo around natural gas is wrong. I mean, fracking itself is itself an environmentally destructive process, and the natural gas is leaking out methane, which many of you know has 86 times greater greenhouse gas potential than CO2 over 20 years. So it is a serious problem. I'm embarrassed to say I come from a state where they extract shale gas with great pride, and we see it in Pennsylvania as really a David versus Goliath issue. The good thing is that those of public health and speak as physicians increasingly need to speak out about the damage that fracking has done to our patients and what it's doing in terms of climate change. I won't belabor that much further.
And I guess there was a clarifying point that renewable natural gas is gas from organic waste on the site of Philadelphia Energy Solutions. So I don't know if that clarifies a little bit, but we should move on, though, to the next question. Somebody did bring up the point that you said, Hunter, 12 years, but what's the rate of action that needs to be taken? One can't simply wait until, say, year 12.
Yeah, it's something like possibly, anywhere in the range of like 5 to 8% a year. Okay. It's maybe closer to the 5% rate, but you have to sort of manage that the first couple of years are going to be tentative, and in some locations emissions are actually increasing, so you just can't all of a sudden pivot on a dime to go from increasing to a decline of 7%. And that's the fundamental challenge that we have here, is that we have delayed taking action so long that it's getting pretty challenging to change course, especially politically. I don't want to undersell the politics here. I think it's been demonstrated here that it is a big challenge. I'm just saying, thankfully, it's not an economic challenge, and anybody who sort of throws it up in our face, we should be clear to push back and say, no, wait a minute, this is not actually what's best for consumers or best for our pocketbooks or best for our kids. The only people who benefit from delay are the fossil fuel industry in terms of economics.
Another question is with respect to developing countries, in particular China. How would you categorize them as an emerging market, and what role are they going to play?
Well, it's fascinating to look at China. They are definitely the biggest polluter in terms of national total pollution. But the average person in China pollutes far, far less than the average person in the United States. And in addition, the United States has been polluting for decades and decades. And as we know, one of the issues with carbon pollution is that it accumulates. It's kind of like mercury in the ecosystem. What matters is how much has been put out. And so taken all together, the United States is still a much bigger emitter than China. So what China needs to do is need to make a choice about which path is it going to grow on. Is it going to grow on the clean energy path, or is it going to grow on the coal-fired power plant? And right now, it's not clear. They are building way more solar and way more wind than the United States. They're investing. They have 3,000 fully electric buses in China. In the United States, we have 300 fully electric buses. Just to give some sense of how far ahead of us China is. But at the same time, China is still operating its coal-fired power plants. It still has coal-fired power plants that they began building, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, or whatever, and they're completing the construction of them. And so they're very much at a crossroads. And this is, I think, where the lack of leadership by the United States really makes a difference. Similarly with Brazil, people might have watched the enormous turnaround. We now have a new president of Brazil who has actually declared that they are going to dramatically increase the deforestation, the clearing of the Amazon to create more land for agribusiness. And I think this is really where the lack of leadership from the United States really, really hurts.
Actually, I wanted to mention one thing about China, just as an interesting statistics. China regulates its internal combustion engine by taxing their license plate. So if you want to buy a license plate for an internal combustion engine car in Shanghai, it will cost you 14,000 US dollars. That's right, 14,000. If you want an electric vehicle, it will cost you nothing. It's free. Talk about, that's politically unfeasible in America, but in China, they can do it.
So here's a question about U.S. policy. Is there a list of policy recommendations for national, state, and city, county level in the NCA or elsewhere that you would recommend that we look at? And just to tack on to that, in particular, what should physicians be recommending?
Well, maybe I can tackle part of that, and I will leave the physicians' questions to other people on the call. The National Climate Assessment did not make any recommendations about a mitigation or pollution reductions. Not too surprisingly, given that this was actually a science report from the Bush administration. And that's kind of interesting to note that all these findings, like for instance, that half of all wildfires are due to climate change in the Western United States, that finding was approved by 13 federal agencies under the Bush administration. So this is about as bulletproof of a science report as you can get, but they did not get into what we should do about it. And so I think you have to look more to the benchmarks that the IPCC set out, which is the reduction of pollution by 50% by 2030. So any state, any city that's putting out a plan, I think that's a clear benchmark. Are you going to reduce pollution by 50% by 2030? What are you doing to electrify your vehicle fleet as well? So unfortunately, there's not an easy answer. There's lots and lots of advocates with lots and lots of plans, but I don't want to privilege one over the other, and then I'll leave the physician stuff to the physicians on the call.
Well, obviously, again, I to do all we can to advocate for moving toward renewable energy. But I'll let you go on to the next question, or do you want to call it at the time?
Yeah, we are at this point at 9 o'clock, or actually 9:01. Barb, should we?
Yes, I'm afraid we really are just about out of time. I'd like to thank once again our guest speaker, Hunter Cutting of Climate Nexus, and Dr. Tsu for his response. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There were some very thoughtful and thought-provoking questions asked. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Good night, and best wishes for the holidays. We hope to be in touch with you again in 2019. Bye all.
Thanks. Bye all.